But then the church was hardly living in the real world when it came to women's roles. The reality was that women often took on exactly the same work as men, in addition to having children and running the home.
Take Margaret Paston, for example, who lived in and around Norwich in the 15th century. That's one of the family homes down there. Well, there must have been times when Margaret found her role as a country housewife rather more eventful than anyone could have imagined.
The family's showpiece was Caister Castle in Norfolk. It was one of the earliest all-brick properties in England, with 40 bedrooms, 2 halls, a chapel, kitchen, larder, cellar, buttery, pantry, armoury, brewery, bakery and stables. And Margaret ran the whole show. But over and above all this, Margaret was even expected to fill her husband's shoes as a warrior when the need arose. The Pastons were a family on the make, who had acquired a lot of land in Norfolk very quickly, and acquired a lot of enemies into the bargain. Margaret's husband John was a sharp lawyer who spent most of his time in London, leaving his wife at home in Norfolk.
Sad for them, but lucky for us, because it meant the loving couple kept writing to each other. And by a small miracle, a lot of their letters have survived. And these tell us that while her husband was away defending the family interests in court, Margaret was back home in Norfolk, defending the estates in a rather more dramatic way.
In 1448, a certain Lord Moleyns claimed that the house she was currently living in belonged to him, and he threatened to attack her with a small army.
Margaret sent to her husband a request for certain domestic supplies. Right worshipful husband, I pray you to get some crossbows and handles to wind them with, and arrows, and also 2 or 3 short poleaxes. I pray that you also have brought for me 1 pound of almonds and 1 pound of sugar, and some broadcloth for a hood for me.
Eventually, Lord Moleyns sent in 1,000 armed men with battering rams and pans of fire. They dug mines under the building, and the wall of the chamber where Margaret was sitting collapsed.
She was carried off, presumably complete with crossbows, poleaxes, almonds and sugar.
As the Middle Ages progresses, women's improving status can be seen reflected in what they wore. But although medieval women began to take on men's roles, the more equality they acquired, the more they dressed to emphasize their femininity. Medieval clothing expert Sarah Thursfield showed me some of the latest styles with the help of the borough players at Gainsborough Old Hall, Lincolnshire.
Everybody has a mental picture of the medieval lady with the traffic cone on her head.
Yeah.
And as far as we can tell, English women never actually wore
Really?
traffic cones on their heads. You get the shorter version, not the long-pointed Burgundian fantasy.
In the 14th century, you've got more elaborate, more splendid costumes, and for both men and women.
Possibly not more splendid, but a shift is from loose layers of nice fabric to things which really fit the body very closely. The gown is a generic term for what both men and women wear on the outside.
Yeah.
And this is about as grand as it gets, because this is velvet. She's a lady, her husband's big with the court, they can afford velvet. Most of us can't.
So what sort of social standing would you be?
I'm a respectable sort of lower middle class widow.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm not nearly as fitted as Dawn.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to pull everything in. Lady Borough, she's dressed for dinner, she's dressed for ceremony, so it's a matter of impressing everyone when she comes to the hall, looking her part, looking her status.
14th century seems to be actually one of the best times for women.
Oh, yes, yes.
Within 100 years of the conquest, noble ladies had moved from wearing simple gowns to elaborate embroidery and even more elaborate hairstyles. And as trade increased, making a greater variety of coloured cloths available, women began making strong statements about who they were by what they wore. By the middle of the 14th century, women had become more empowered, thanks, ironically, to a social catastrophe. The Black Death wiped out half the population of England by 1350. As a result, there was a chronic labour shortage. Women had to take on roles that had traditionally been reserved for men.
A new kind of damsel began to emerge, the business damsel. We don't know much about these women since they didn't leave much record, probably too busy doing business. However, in 1934, a 500-year-old manuscript was discovered, and it turned out to be the autobiography of exactly such a woman. Her name was Marjorie Kemp, and she was born here in King's Lynn in 1373.
From the start, she enjoyed a pretty good lifestyle. Marjorie saw herself as a bit of a trendy dresser. She wore her hair braided into gold nets, and her clothes were slashed to reveal even richer cloth underneath. Ooh la la.
Marjorie's husband must have thought she looked good enough without the frills, or else he thought the frills were too expensive. Either way, he refused to pay for them. So Marjorie, as a modern go-getting woman, decided to earn the money for herself, and she set up in town as a brewer.
The greatest in the town of Lynn.
But then an odd thing happened. She started to lose her head. Well, at least her beer started to lose its head. It would be fermenting away, building up a nice head like this, and then the head would suddenly go flat and sink to the bottom. And quite honestly, not having enough head is about the most embarrassing thing that can happen to any brewer. And after a while, her brewers decided they couldn't stand the professional disgrace, and they ran away, and the business collapsed.
Marjorie wasn't to be beaten. She bought horses and a mill and set herself up to grind corn. But then the horses started to go backwards. Eventually, the miller ran away. Oh! And then it was noised about the town of Lynn that neither man nor beast would work for her. It was time for a versatile woman like Marjorie to make another career change. And though it may seem an odd choice to us, she decided to become a full-time, professional religious hysteric.
Marjorie discovered that the thing she could do really well was weeping. And I don't just mean the odd sniffle in the corner when she felt sad. She wept in public, extremely loudly, and incessantly. She'd weep through meal times, she'd weep through sermons, she'd scream and yell and start rolling on the floor. A holy woman said it was a gift from the Holy Spirit, but most people thought it was just a damn nuisance.
When Marjorie went on pilgrimage, for example, her fellow pilgrims couldn't stand the way she wept and screamed through dinner. They ditched her before they got a quarter of the way to Jerusalem. So maybe not the typical businesswoman of the day, but at least before she died, she made it into the Guild. And here on the accounts for the Trinity Guild for 1438, we can see her record of her membership payment. Marjorie Kemp, 20 shillings. Damsels, it seemed, were becoming very much a part of what had been strictly a man's world. In Richard II's court, for example, women enjoyed a high profile. It was a very sophisticated court. Refinement and sensitivity were the new buzzwords, replacing the old lad's army preoccupation with martial arts and getting drunk. The emphasis was on the arts, on poetry, music, fashion, and haute cuisine. It was enough to turn the stomach of the more conservative chroniclers. The king surrounds himself with knights of Venus, more valiant in the bedchamber than on the battlefields. Richard was the first king to create a woman a duchess in her own right. Women, it seemed, were going places. But the pendulum, which had been swinging in women's direction throughout the Middle Ages, began to swing the other way. By 1450, there was no longer a shortage of labour. The population had begun to stabilise, and the economic cycle went into reverse, with women being the first to be squeezed out. It was the start
of the backlash.
One of the clearest examples of this backlash against feminine power is the extraordinary story of Joan of Arc. In 1429, the French were losing the war against the English when the French army was put under the command of a 16-year-old peasant girl who claimed divine guidance. Joan routed the English at Orleans, but was captured the following year. She had gone into battle dressed as a man, and she kept these clothes on in prison. The pants and tunic firmly laced together, apparently as a defense against being raped by her guards. But she was told that for a woman to wear men's clothing was a crime against God, and for that crime she was burned to death.
Something sinister was going on. Later, it would be claimed in England that Joan was burned as a witch, but that wasn't true. The medieval world didn't go in much for witchcraft. Centuries of Christian teaching had taught that such beliefs were mere superstition.
What was being made clear, however, was that for a woman to take over a man's role was henceforth to be regarded as unnatural.
The wickedness of women is greater than all the other wickedness of the world.
As men sought to constrain women's role in society, they began to demonize women, and they enlisted the help of the church to do it.
God's sentence hangs over all your sex.
In 1484, the Pope pronounced that witches were not figments of the imagination, but a present evil, and his words sparked a European-wide, well, witch hunt is the only word for it. It would lead to the judicial execution of thousands of women. In fact, during the period that followed the so-called Renaissance, relationships between damsels and their men deteriorated dramatically. And it was no good the women of the Renaissance looking to St. George to save them. During this period, the dragon that St. George kills sometimes mysteriously acquires female genitalia. What on earth was going on? One interpretation is that St. George represents chastity, and the dragon symbolizes loose, uncontrolled female sexuality, which can undermine male authority. Women must submit to control by men. The superstition and brutality directed against women was a product of the Renaissance, not of the Middle Ages, and it has stained the history of the last 500 years right down to today.
The last 2 centuries have proved a far darker time for women than the Middle Ages ever were. In the Victorian era, any woman who was interested in sex was deemed to be either sick or mad.
It's an attitude that would have been incomprehensible to people of the Middle Ages. The Victorians were determined to marginalize the role of women in society, to strip them of power and to deprive them even of their sexuality. That's why they invented the medieval damsel in distress.